Hello, everybody. My name is Johanna O'Shea. I'm a lecturer in social work at Maynooth University, and I want to talk to you today about a project I was involved in facilitating between social work students and young men in prison. And really the focus today is looking at the project and thinking about what were the lessons for undertaking research. So the title of the presentation is Learning from Young Adults in Prison. And that really underpins the sort of ethos, the whole ethos around the project, that we were there to learn from the young men, learn about their experiences of the justice system, their experiences of social work, and what we could learn from those experiences. So I'll talk a lot more about the project going forward through the presentation, but maybe for now I should talk really a little bit about where the motivation came from. So service user engagement really within social work education, or research for that matter, is contested, and there are concerns sometimes that social work is good at engaging with certain service users and for others maybe not so. But certainly for young people within the justice system, it is practically non-existent, and they really are not included in a lot of service user engagement in social work education and research, which, you know, we were, myself, my colleague who facilitated this project, were quite concerned about. So we wanted to think about how do we genuinely engage the voice and experiences of the most excluded young people, but in a way that is meaningful for both them and for the students. So not the once-off engagement, not the once-off interview or focus group, but maybe, you know, an engagement that requires a little bit more investment, and an engagement that has more meaning and is ultimately more productive, essentially, over time then. So the structure of the presentation is, I'll give a brief overview of the project. I should say there were two elements to this project. One element, the strand, was in the community, facilitated by my colleague, Emma McGuinness, but I am going to focus primarily here on the custodial element of the project, which I facilitated. And again, I'm just going to refer briefly to some of the project days and experiences, but only with a view to thinking about them in terms of what are the key lessons for undertaking research. I should say at this point, actually, that this officially was not a research project, even though it started out life as one. The initial plan was to undertake an action research project with students and young men in prison, but because of the grants that we were depending on, there were short-term grants. We had to adapt because we didn't have time basically to apply for ethical approval for a research project. So we adapted this to an active learning project. But essentially, for all intents and purposes, everything else was undertaken as if this was a research project, and the parallels are very, very similar to undertaking research. So the aims then of the project, and like I said, I was involved in the custodial strand of this, were essentially to enable social work students understand what it means to be excluded for young people. And secondly, and really importantly, what socially excluded young people need from social work, what their experiences of social work were, and what they needed from social workers. We also had to think, obviously, about what if we were going to engage over a longer period with a group of young people, what were we going to do in that time? And so we used the hook of multimedia to engage with the young people, and the students obviously found that interesting as well. And finally, it was also to provide excluded young people with opportunities to envisage education as achievable. So we did that on two levels, I think, because, you know, a multimedia project, the Bites Project in Derry, worked with us here, and they enabled the young people to complete a qualification in multimedia through the project, but also the fact that the young men were engaging with university students, talking about why they went to university, what decisions they made along the way, and so on. I think helped the young men sometimes to think about education for themselves as achievable. So the first point I want to make is around thinking around the venue for engaging with excluded and marginalized groups. Obviously, we were restricted here because we had to meet with the young men in prison, but within that environment, we had to think about where was the best place to meet, to carry out the project activities, and so on. Again, within the, we didn't have free choice, obviously, but we did, as far as possible, want to avoid using the formal education facilities. Because I knew from my own background in working as a probation officer and that some of the young men would have negative connotations around their experiences in education in the prison. So it was agreed that we would use the chapel and the prison grounds, but we negotiated successfully that there would be no security. So we would not use personal alarms. There would be no security personnel with us. Now that was agreed eventually, but it met with some resistance, I must say, from prison staff on the ground, who didn't agree with that stance by the governor. But it was important, and we argued successfully that it was important for us in terms of engagement with the young people that we didn't have any security trappings, and that we didn't say we needed to have a personal alarm to meet with them. And we wanted to engage with them as equal partners in terms of creating this resource and project. And that was ultimately agreed. The second point I want to make around the venue was the fact that we had lunch together each day. So normally in the prison, there would be prisoners were given their lunch at 12 o'clock and then locked up until 2 o'clock. So from 12:30 to 2 o'clock, which would have meant 2 hours out of our day. And we wanted to avoid that at all costs. So we agreed that we would have lunch together in a cafe on the grounds, which was essentially a staff cafe, and I had to ensure that the group went there at 12 o'clock for lunch and that we were out of there by 12:30, and that we stayed within the chapel until 2 o'clock when staff lunch finished. But the reason I mentioned that really is it was a really important element to the day. And in the subsequent evaluation at the end of the project, both the students and the young men mentioned this numerous times, how important it was that we stayed together, that it was it gave a sense of group belonging for the project, that we stayed together all day, and that we ate together. I thought it was really interesting, just the most basic of things, to have have a meal together was seen as really important. And one student remarked that was where you really felt we are the same. We are sitting here together, having lunch together. And so that's something to think about, I think, in terms of engaging with excluded groups. Also, we used outdoor activities and gym and so on and so forth as much as we could within the prison environment. But what was interesting was sometimes we were able to meet with individual young people outside of the prison if they had leave or if they had been released on remand, full on remand. But they really, none of them would agree to meet us at the university. So again, that was learning for us to see that certain venues, certain buildings act as a barrier to engagement, and certainly for the young men, the university was somewhere they didn't want to go. So we had 8 young men, 5 social work students, and we had 10 project days over a period of about 3 months. So there were, I suppose, the biggest challenges for us in terms of running the project was operating within a custodial setting and expecting the unexpected. But again, I mentioned that here, obviously we can't go into a lot of detail, but I mention it here because in a strange way, it contributed in also positively to the sense of group belonging and group responsibility for the project developing. So there were days, for example, when we couldn't leave the chapel because the prison was locked down. There were other days, you know, there was a side door to the chapel led onto a little yard where people could go out and sit in the sun if it was a nice day. Or the young people went out there for a cigarette sometimes, which was important to defuse situations sometimes if things were getting a bit heated. Another week I was told that was a breach of security and that door needed to remain locked at all times. I've subsequently on another project day inquired about this door and what was the situation, could it be open or closed, or what was the story, and I was asked, well, why don't I just take a key? So it changed constantly, the situation changed, and we needed to adapt on an hourly basis to what was going on in the prison. But really that changing and sometimes very frustrating environment and sometimes resistance that we experienced from some staff towards the project contributed ultimately to a positive sense of group belonging and group responsibility for developing the project. So sometimes when we couldn't leave the chapel, for example, we had to adapt, and you know, there was one day we had a pub quiz, another day we had a speed dating event, and so on. And the young men embraced that as much as the students in terms of taking responsibility for ensuring that we had a positive experience on all of the project days. And that didn't happen, obviously, you know, immediately. There was a lot of anxiety at the beginning in terms of the students managing their anxieties about what if they don't want to engage with us, what if they reject us because we're university students and we have nothing in common with them. One young man in particular felt very uncomfortable on the first day with the icebreaker that we used, and threw the head up and left and had to be taken back to the landing. Now he subsequently re-engaged. I met with him separately and so on. But the young men spoke about how daunting it was for them on day one to come into the chapel and to meet the young students. And they were equally, they had such anxieties thinking about what will we ever have to talk about with each other. But contracting with all project participants was really, really important. And one issue that we emphasized throughout was, and from the very beginning, was that we had absolutely no interest in why they were in prison or how long their sentence was or anything to do with any of that. It was none of our business, and we wouldn't be asking them anything about it. Now the young people themselves decided. Subsequently, they built relationships with the students, and they used to confide sometimes in the students about those issues, but they weren't required to, obviously. So we planned the daily structure as far as possible. And like I said, I mean, the process became just as important as the outcome. There was a lot of downtime, and that was important for me as the facilitator to accept also that actually I needed to allow a lot of downtime for the young adults to get to know each other, to chat a lot, to talk about, from one week to the next, very soon they started to build relationships, and they, couldn't wait to meet up again to let each other know about whatever had gone on with X, Y, and Z. So that was really important, and having fun was really important. But allowing the project experience to take its course, I'll give you one example. At very early in days, one of the female students realized she was aware of one of the young men. She was aware of his conviction for a sexual offense. He was from a town not far from where she came from. And she spoke with me about that and said she didn't know if she was going to be able to engage with him, which was fine. We said we would run with that, and she wasn't going to be forced to do anything, obviously, or to work with anybody individually if she didn't want to. But actually, she said herself later, that in very, very quickly, that became a side issue for her, and she got to know the young man and realized that she could separate out those things, and they engaged really, really well. And actually on the final project day, when we were saying goodbye to the young men, and the students were spontaneously giving the young man a hug and so on, and everybody was saying goodbye, I noticed how she actually walked up to that young man and embraced him, and that was just, it was nice to see how those relationships had developed over that 3-month period. Another issue, for example, that arose, there were numerous days where plans were disrupted, but on one occasion we had driven to the prison, and there had been a terrorist attack against a prison officer a few days prior to that. And actually in the morning that we arrived in the prison, it transpired that the man had tragically died. So the atmosphere, obviously within the prison and among staff, was incredibly tense, and there was a lot of anger, a lot of resistance towards senior management and so on. And we were being told by senior management, look, the project will go ahead, we will get the guys down to you shortly, but individual prison officers were saying to us, we won't, everybody's staying in lockdown, we are not opening up the cells. And anyway, we stayed on the grounds that day. We attended a memorial service for the prison officer who had been killed. And in the afternoon, the young men finally joined us and were brought down to the chapel. And they told us that actually they had been told that we hadn't arrived, and that the project was no longer going ahead. But actually some of them saw us walking across the yard and had insisted that they be brought down, that the project was going ahead. And things like that really contributed to a sense of belonging, a sense of trust, because we had said to them at the beginning we would let them know if we ever were not attending on a Wednesday as planned. We would certainly let them know when the project was finishing and so on. So like I said, it was important to let the project experiences take their course and allow the participants to steer things as much as possible. Two of the topics that we really wanted to cover with the young people were their experiences of the justice system and their experiences of social work. But what it subsequently transpired through our engagement with the young men was that they also wanted to include the impact of the justice system, imprisonment, the impact of having social work involved in their lives. They wanted to include this in the project materials and in the DVD, and they also wanted to talk about their future plans. So that was important for them to be included. I share that with you because I think it's important to realize that the research process with these types of projects, whether it's action research or active learning, is not necessarily linear. You don't just design your project, get your ethical approval, carry out your field work, and analyze your data. There has to be a high level of adaptability and openness to changing, and the process to ensuring that project participants or research participants have as much input as possible. Certainly in this project, timing and pacing were key. We had to spend a lot of time building trust. We had to spend a lot of time getting to know the young people. Obviously, there were issues with the environment that we were operating within, but there were also issues for the young men, and sometimes they were having one person may be having a bad day. They had a lot of issues going on themselves, trying to manage within the environment that they were living in, but also manage other external issues with their families and so on. So we had to pace our planning of the project and time issues, taking account of all of that. Another major issue that came up was the issue of consent. I certainly had said that, we would ensure their anonymity, we would protect confidentiality, we would use still images of photographs that had been taken on the grounds of the prison and the garden centre and so on and so forth. we would use voiceover technology and so on. And very quickly into the project, I was challenged on all of this by the young men themselves and by the students. And, you know, they were saying, hang on a minute here, you know, why are you saying you're going to protect our identity? We want to be identified here. This is our project too. Why are you saying we can't be identified on it? Nobody said that when we were in court. Nobody said it when my name was splashed across the Sunday Life because of what I had done. Nobody, you know, everybody in Derry knows I'm in prison. Now you're saying it has to remain a secret that I was involved in something good, that I did something really positive. And the students said to me, you know, you talk about self-determination, you talk about choice, you talk about personal responsibility. Why are you saying now that you are making that decision? And ultimately, I had to review this sort of paternalistic attitude that I had obviously taken. And we spent a lot of time with the young people. We spent a lot of individual time with each young man, going over worst case scenarios in terms of them revealing and being their identity and being identified on the materials in years to come. But ultimately they decided that they wanted to be included. And as you can see on the photographs here that are used in this presentation, they are identifiable on these materials, and that was their choice. So we, you know, little things we did when we were undertaking the research. The young men interviewed the students as well as the students interviewing the young men. So they you know, they asked them about their life experiences, about their decisions that they had made at different stages in their lives. In terms of creating the DVD, obviously there was a bit of a logistical nightmare with the prison environment, but we did what we could in terms of, you know, we created the materials in the grounds, the video clips, the photographs. We took the materials back to the Bites Multimedia Project in Derry, created little podcasts, created snippets, which we would bring the following week to the prison to show the young men and to get their agreement or approval or ideas for further development of the materials. Now, obviously at each point when we left and the prison, we had to give all materials to security. And again, when we would go to the prison, we had to give everything back to security for them to check. So there was a lot of effort put into ensuring the young men were as involved as possible in developing the resource and in having an input into the resource. But a lot of the discussion initially was around the fact that this was going to be used as an educational resource in the University of Ulster in Derry. As it transpired, you know, the young men, I think, really embraced that notion of them being educators and being the experts by experience in terms of what young people need from social work. And so they, you know, the idea came about that maybe we should use it across other universities as well. And that was ultimately agreed. And the resource was shared across the universities that deliver social work education in Ireland. So like I said, I mean, we tried as far as possible to ensure that the young men were equal partners, but that takes a lot of effort, a lot of thought, a lot of commitment, and a lot of reflection at different parts and at different points of the project and discussion. The project essentially was evaluated successfully by both the students and the young people. I'm conscious of the fact that I'm over time here now, so I am going to move on quickly. Just to the main point I wanted to make in relation to this was we had, you know, an award ceremony, celebratory lunch and so on and so forth, and the students made a comic book from the project materials. But one thing we did that might have been a little bit controversial was we gave each young man a gift of a £25 voucher for a sports shop, or if they were being released, or we put it on their prison tuck shop account. And that actually was a huge issue for the young men, and they just seemed incredibly appreciative of that, even though it was a very small amount. But I think it was the acknowledgement, and just even a small amount to say thank you to them for their engagement on the project. You can read a lot more about the project in that article that we published about it, but ultimately, what I just want to say, as a final point to make, that the project, I think, really demonstrates that social justice principles should underpin service user participation, whether that's in social work education or in research. And that translates really into engagement over a significant period of time, where there is time to build up trust, there's time to get to know one another, there's time for service users to co-design, to share their ideas, and to co-plan a project or a piece of research. But also it allows time where those power structures and that the sort of hierarchy of relationships that exist can be dismantled and can be broken down, and where they are at least diminished as far as possible. So I will be available on the day to take any of your questions, and thank you for listening.